Okay, so here's all the supplies that you need to pour epoxy countertops. Epoxy, obviously, part A, and part B. It's a 1-to-1 mix on countertop epoxy. You need to have 2 buckets, one for part A and one for part B. And you might, if you're doing multiple pours or multiple areas, you might want to have a bucket for each pour. So a part A and a part B for each pour. If not, then you want to label your buckets A and B. And then you need a bigger bucket, obviously a bucket that has enough room to fit both part A and part B in it. And the bucket needs to be completely flat inside, no ridges or anything. You want to be able to scrape the sides of your buckets really well with a paint stick, so you want your buckets to be totally smooth inside, a flat bottom. So don't use a coffee can or anything like that, because you won't be able to scrape the sides and you won't be able to mix your product well. So you're also going to need tape. I like to use painter's tape first and then go over that with duct tape. You need to have latex or some sort of gloves, and I would highly recommend that you get yourself a little bit of powder, some sort of powder or maybe cornstarch, and go ahead and pre-pour a little bit of powder into each glove before you get started, because while you're working, your hands are going to be sweaty and sticky, no doubt, and it's very difficult to get a new pair of gloves on unless there's powder inside the gloves. And you need paint sticks. Get yourself a bunch of paint sticks, like maybe 5 to 10 paint sticks. You need brushes for spreading out your epoxy. These little shorty brushes are the best. And if you're doing more than one area, you definitely want to have a brush for each area, because the epoxy does harden in the brush pretty quickly, so your brush will be no good in no time flat. You're going to need some sort of a spreader, like these flat spreaders here. They come in a 3-pack at Home Depot or from Total Boat Epoxy. They send you those too. You could also use a notched trowel. I don't like to do that because it could potentially, the metal could potentially scrape, but a lot of people use notched trowels. Some people like to use a roller. Then of course you're going to need your spray paint, your Rust-Oleum spray paint. That it has to be spray paint to make your design. You can use any brand of spray paint, it just has to be spray paint, and obviously in the colors that you want to use. I like to use black and white in order to mix my own gray. You can buy gray, but mixing it is easy. That way you can get the saturation of the gray that you want. So, and also I've got gold and then a beige. So those are the spray paints. You also want to make sure that you have an area to keep all of your supplies, whether it's on a tarp on the floor or on a table. I used the top of the stove and covered it with plastic. Obviously, my friend is actually getting a new stove, so I went ahead and used it. Otherwise, I wouldn't do that. I would put it on the floor on a tarp or something. But it's a good idea to have all your supplies in one place, because once you start pouring out the epoxy, you've only got about a 45-minute open time to get everything done. So you're going to be in a bit of a hurry, and it's a little bit nerve-wracking on your first couple go-rounds. So it's good to have all your supplies handy and all in one place. Okay, then the next step is to prep your area, and one very important thing to do is to cover the air condition vent in the room that you're working. This is quite important because when the air conditioner kicks on, it does stir up dust, whether it's coming out of the vent or just stirring up dust in the room. You definitely want to cover your vent because it will drop dust onto your countertop. So cover that with a plastic bag or a garbage bag or something. Okay, and next you need to tape off your area. You want to use masking tape or painter's tape to hang the tarps below your countertops and inside your sink. And then I like to go over the painter's tape again with duct tape just to make sure that none of that plastic falls off during your process, because that has happened to me before. And make sure that over the dishwasher you get that tape deep in there. You may want to open the dishwasher and tape that door, or use a paint stick to make sure that that tape is far back in there, covering the dishwasher really well, because I did not do that in my own kitchen and had to pick epoxy out of the controls of my dishwasher. So make sure your dishwasher is taped really well. And you want to go ahead and protect your walls, but make sure you leave about 1/8 of an inch gap so you don't lock in the tape. Okay, so here we go with the pour, and stick around a bit and see what one very, very important item I forgot to bring with me. So with the epoxy, you're going to pour, countertop epoxy is going to be a 1-to-1 ratio, and it's very important that it is exactly 1-to-1. So you want to get level with your buckets so you can make sure that they are exactly the same amount. And then you want to make sure that you scrape every bit out of part A and out of part B. So just make sure they're exactly the same, that you're on a fairly level surface so that you can make sure that your amounts are exactly the same. Okay, gloves going on, and then I'm going to leave this part in real time because I want you to see how much I scrape the bucket to get all the product off the sides and off the bottom of the bucket, and make sure that you scrape your paint stick along the side of your bucket as well to get any product off of your paint stick because you don't want to leave any product so that you end up with an uneven mix of resin to cure, or part A to part B. So just scrape, scrape, scrape until you get it all out of the bucket. Okay, then part B, and then mix for 3 to 5 minutes. And this is about where I realized the very important thing I forgot. I forgot one of the most important things. I knew it. And I'm mixing up the resin right now. Is there any way you could bring me my heat gun? I think it's in the garage on one of the shelves. Yeah, thank you, honey. Bye. So thank God I don't live far away, only about 15 minutes. And there's no way I could hold up pouring the epoxy, because if you leave the epoxy in the bucket, it hardens up in 5 minutes flat. But if you pour it out onto your countertop, you've got a lot longer working time, about 45 minutes or more. So I had to go ahead and pour the epoxy out, even though I didn't have a heat gun to pop the bubbles, which is pretty important. So here I'm pouring it all out. I'm scraping the bottom of the bucket, and then I'll grab my spatula thingy and spread that out. I like to go ahead and mix the epoxy even a little bit more on the countertop in case there was any part in the bucket that I didn't mix up well in the corners of the bucket or on the sides of the bucket. So I mix it up on the countertop again for a little bit as I'm spreading it out all the way to the edges. And so I don't spread my epoxy all the way to the edges. Don't let it flow over the edges quite yet. I wait until it sets up a little bit more before I let it flow over the edges. Otherwise, you're going to lose a lot of epoxy to the floor. So spread it to the edge, but not over the edge yet. And you'll see I spread my epoxy pretty thin. I like to go thin coats because I don't like to waste a lot of epoxy, and the biggest reason is because the thicker you pour your epoxy, the more it will yellow. And I learned it firsthand in my own kitchen, where I went deeper in one spot because there was a crack and one side was thicker than the other, and the side where the epoxy is very thick has yellowed and the other side is not, and you can clearly see it. So that's why I like to pour the epoxy in thin coats and just really spread it out, spread it thin. So after spreading it out with the trowel thingy, I'm going to go ahead and mix up another batch for the other side and to finish up this side because I got pretty thin on this side. So I'm going to mix up the same exact amount for that other corner and this remaining corner. This is where it would be a real good idea to have a second person helping you, because you could have that second person mixing your second batch as you're spreading out the first, and it'll give you a lot more time, working time for your design part. So this is definitely a job that would be best done with 2 people, particularly on your first try. So I just poured out the second batch. I mixed up 750 ml of each part A and part B. So what's that? 1,500 ml total. So I used two 2 pours of 1500 ml. Okay, so now I'm going to switch up to the brush to spread out the rest of the epoxy and bring it all the way to the edges and then over the edges. The brush will give you a more even coat of epoxy. The trowel or the spreader, you do see some higher points where it kind of pulls off the edge of the trowel. So with the brush, you can really get a good smooth finish and then start letting it guiding it over the edge onto the front of your countertop, and then use the brush to spread it on the front of the countertop. So that's why I switched to the brush. It gives a nice level, and it helps level out the epoxy a lot better. Okay, and I'm going to leave this all in real time, even though it's a bit slow to watch me do this, but I want you to be able to see how long it takes me and that it can be done. Although this, again, would be better with 2 people, because obviously I poured out the epoxy over in the corner on the other side of the sink and had to just let it sit while I leveled out the other side. If you had a second person, they could be leveling out that corner bit with a brush or trowel and even pulling the epoxy over to this side toward the camera where you see that there's no epoxy on the counter. So, and then that would obviously give me a lot more time to work on the design part before the epoxy sets up a lot. So I would suggest having a helper on a job like this, for sure.
Yeah, will that plug work? I don't know if it has 3 prongs or not, but...
Do you have your clothes plugged in too, or no?
No.
It doesn't.
Thank you. I was mixing up my first bucket, and I realized, whoa,
You want on
buddy.
this side or on that side?
This side's good. You just set it right. You could actually set it right on top of this box. That would be great.
This box here?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Oh, I mean, it looks amazing.
Thank God for my husband that he was able to bring that heat gun over to me, because even though the epoxy says that it doesn't get bubbles, it does, and you do have to pop some of the bubbles with the heat gun. So I'm almost done spreading it. I'm just pulling the epoxy from the thick points on the countertop and covering all the edges, and I'm almost ready to put on the design. Now the design part, my camera battery died, so I had to use the video footage that I got from my iPhone that was sitting on the windowsill. So the footage of this design part, I slowed it down because it was on time lapse. So it's a little bit weird, but you'll see the design part coming up next. So I'm mixing up my spray paint, which is something you want to shake your cans of spray paint ahead of time, which is a good idea, especially if you're working alone. Then spray the paint into the bucket, and I sprayed it right into the bucket that had a little bit of epoxy left in it so that I could mix my gray myself in with the epoxy that was there. It helps it to flow better onto the counter and mix with the epoxy on the counter if there's a little bit of epoxy left in the bucket. And by a little, I mean just really a little in there. I scraped the bucket pretty good, but whatever's left does pool on the bottom, and that's where I mix my spray paint. So I mixed my black and my white together to get the perfect color gray, and then just start putting it on the counter, and you can do it in any which way. I would suggest making yourself a sample board before you go into a project, because then you'll be able to work out how you're going to do this. I go ahead and drip it on there with a paint stick so that my color is still kind of in the vein type shape where it runs like a vein. So that's how I like to put my color on. I just drip it on there with my paint stick, and then I come back in with my brush and really model it or mute it out with my brush. Mike from Stone Coat calls it chopping the paint. So I chop the veins that I just drizzled down onto my countertop with the brush. I chop it out so it makes it real subtle and very soft. And then I will go back with another drizzling or dripping of paint across it once I've got a nice soft background for my veins. Then I go back in and lay down another really thin vein line, and I'll generally leave that vein line as it is so it looks like a vein. And here I am chopping out the first bit of paint that I put on the countertop, and this is what makes it soft and subtle and feathering. I just feather it out by chopping it, and then I'll drag my brush a little bit through the paint so it gives a real nice soft backdrop for the veins that I'll put in next with another coat of paint. Okay, so this is almost where my camera battery dies and it goes into my iPhone, which was on time lapse, so I just slowed it down. That's why it looks the way it does with the movement. Anyway, I'm gonna let it roll because I think it might still help for some people to see close up and from this angle how I go about the design part or the veining part on my countertop. So I just drip it down and then chop it out to make it really subtle, like you see there. And I used a gray as the backdrop for the countertop. I obviously pour my first coat completely clear, and then I add in the only color is with the spray paint and this veining and then chopping and then adding more and then chopping. I don't have any color in that first coat or the first pour of epoxy. It's completely clear, and I just add in the spray paint. Some people do add in white to the base coat. I don't do that. I put the base coat color in the coat of paint that I put on the countertop. It's just, you know, regular house paint. And I used, in this particular kitchen, I used the exact paint that I used in the upper cabinets so that the background of the countertop is actually the same color as the upper cabinets in this kitchen, and that worked out really well. So you see, I'm just adding in more vein designs to this, using my finger to spread it out and soften it up a little bit and make the design and the shape. So there's a lot of different ways you can do this. You can lay down the paint or drizzle the paint on and then even use a roller to spread it out and soften it up. Some people don't even soften up the veins. They just do a lot of veining on their countertops. But I prefer this method because I really like my countertops to look very authentic and as much like real marble as possible. So here it is complete. The countertop is all finished, and I'm going to come in close and give you a close-up on what the final marbling looks like. It's hard to see in video because there's so much reflection and glare from the lighting. I probably should have just turned all the lights off, but anyway, here it is. You'll see all the different colors in there, and again, it's hard to see on camera the whites that are in there because they just really blend in, but in person it looks really beautiful. And my friend is very happy with her new kitchen. We put in the backsplash next, and check out the video on how I removed the little linoleum backsplash off of this and then bondoed the edge.